So Wall Street's effort to evaluate the virtue of some corporations has produced some odd results, according to new reporting from my colleague Fang at the Intercept, in a new feature that he has out now called Green Colored Glasses, with a subheadline that is delightful. Private prisons are a socially responsible investment, according to bizarre Wall Street measures. Fang, welcome to Rising.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So this is a great piece. So let's walk through what you found. So we're talking about the ESG assessment. This is the environmental, social, and governance measurement that Wall Street applies to firms, basically a virtue scale. And let's start with CoreCivic, this private prison firm, because I think a lot of people might be surprised to find that a private prison firm can be counted as virtuous and socially responsible.
Well, that's right. And, the ESG movement in investing, it's one of the biggest trends in Wall Street. Over $30 trillion are invested in assets that follow ESG, also known as stakeholder capitalism or socially responsible investing. It sounds great. It's a way for the logic of the market to be used to improve the behavior of corporations, whether that's on the environment or racial justice or curbing exploitation or weapons making. But if you kind of look underneath the hood, there's not much there. It's a gigantic reputation improvement service for corporation. It's generating billions of fees for asset managers. It's making millions of dollars for a cottage industry of consultants, and there's not much evidence at all that it's improving society or any core business practices. We kind of opened the piece looking at CoreCivic, the largest private prison corporation in America. They're proudly the first publicly traded private prison company, and earlier this year they made the announcement that after the George Floyd protests of 2020, they're the first corporation to really undergo the latest ESG trend, which is conducting what's known as a racial equity audit. They talk a lot about how they have an MLK mural at one of their prisons, that they have a diverse boardroom, that many of their prison guards are racially diverse. They're non-white prison wardens and prison guards. It sounds incredibly superficial, but it's kind of representative of this entire trend. These companies hire consultants to produce these glossy ESG reports, and that allows them to be included in these big index or mutual funds that are marketed to investors as social responsibility or ESG funds, and money flows to these companies. They get a better return, they get a better reputation, they look woke and they look socially responsible, but they didn't have to change any core business practices. They still make money from the business of incarceration, and there's not much there. It looks great for the companies. It makes a lot of money in fees for the big Wall Street banks, but the business core practices don't change.
Yeah, that's okay. So that I think is probably the most important point here, because clearly it's a transparent appropriation of signals and talking points and language from the far left to just mask raw capitalism in many cases. And this example is such a good one, because the obvious devil's advocate argument from, let's say, people on the center is going to be, well, it's better than nothing, right? Like, it's nudging the sort of capitalist system, or not people on the center, but people on the left. It's nudging the capitalist system to be more socially responsible. But this is one example of how that doesn't play out. And I'm curious, Lee, as to the broader movement, how has ESG affected, if at all, the way some of these major corporations actually do business?
I would say, with maybe a few exceptions, none at all. The trend in ESG investing 5 or 6 years ago was on climate change, and environmental, social responsibility. But if you look carefully into the way that this gets reported, the big rating agencies like MSCI, which rates a lot of these companies on behalf of BlackRock and State Street and the other asset managers, if you look at the fine print, companies are self-reporting that they are improving on the environment but if you look at the net effect, these companies are still increasing their carbon emissions, and they get still positive ESG scores. This is all a self-regulated industry, so companies can kind of hide the ball, and they can choose which suppliers or which subcontractors to report and which ones to conceal. So they can always fudge the numbers and make it look like they're doing right for the environment. On this racial justice trend, which is the biggest kind of hot topic in ESG, pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, private prisons, like we talk about in the piece, are saying, okay, look, we're going to add a Latino or Asian or gay board member to our company. We're going to institute DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion policies. We're going to hire a DEI, VP. But at the end of the day, we haven't found a shred of evidence that these major companies, by enacting these DEI policies or diverse boardrooms, are changing any core business practices. They're still hiking the price of needed medicines. They're still making money from incarceration. They're still making weapons that are used in war. Just because there's elite representation, there's no evidence that's changing any of the fundamental structure of these companies.
And sometimes it seemed as if the representation didn't even change, that the consultants were just able to game the process a little better. Can you talk about the chief executive that you interviewed who went through this process and had the consultants tell him that actually, hey, and I think he was white presenting but was half non-white, like, hey, you're worth points in this in this ESG assessment. And so he told you something like he thought it was ridiculous, but if this is the game that's being played, that he's going to play it just like anybody else.
Yeah, these rules, particularly around race, pardon me, are very easily gamified. This example is a good one. I talked to a CEO. He kind of presents as white. If you kind of looked at him at first glance, you would assume that he is white, but he is a quarter non-white. So for these diverse boardroom, diverse CEO rules that kind of give you an increased ESG score that get you included in these big index or mutual funds that are marketed as socially responsible or diverse, he gets to count as a diverse CEO, which gives him a better ranking. I mean, it's just incredibly arbitrary, but that's just how race is constructed. I mean, it's not a biological reality. This is a social construct. So if you're asking corporations to increase their performance on a social construct, then of course that's subjective. I mean, it's just, he found the rules absurd that he counts as a diverse CEO, but he's playing the rules that are being set out.
Mm-hmm. And it recalls what happened in 2020, where all of these major, obviously capitalistic corporations donated to the official BLM group, which was openly anti-capitalist. And this idea that they would be giving their profits to an anti-capitalist organization is hard to reconcile, except for the fact that they obviously believe there's a market demand for it. And it speaks to the fact that they themselves don't believe these groups are really fundamentally going to dismantle the capitalist system. And that seems to have come through in your interviews, Lee.
No, that's right. I mean, look, one of the biggest ways they kind of hide the bag, and the conceit here is that, this whole movement is around self-regulation, self-reporting, kind of the completely voluntary standards. And they're the big asset managers are encouraging companies to take these kind of proxy battles to increase, diverse boardrooms, make these kind of philanthropic donations. But at the same time, the same big asset managers that are behind this push, Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, State Street, they are against any limits on political spending or any disclosure of political spending. So they're basically saying, look, we want to improve society, but only if corporations are leading the way and doing this as a voluntary effort. If corporations want to bribe or influence legislators and regulators, the folks who are supposed to make the laws that actually do have a long track record of improving society, they don't care. So they're happy to keep. They want social responsibility, an improvement of the public interest, but only on Wall Street and corporate terms. They don't want democracy. They don't want legislators and regulators to actually change the rules and force any change.
I think that really is the key point, because that's what's going on here. There's always going to be pressure, to regulate these businesses to genuinely improve the way that they behave in society, and this is a way to counteract that pressure. And I think if we go back to the private prison example, for instance, one of the greatest ongoing crimes in this country that doesn't get talked about except in jokes is the prevalence of rape and sexual assault in prisons. And so, if Wall Street, through some ESG metrics, was actually able to reduce and eliminate rape in prisons, then okay, wonderful. But it feels like Wall Street has been given a chance, private business has been given a chance here to actually make social progress, and has failed. So do you think that there's any model that could be reformed to drive this type of thing forward, or do you think it really has to come down to government just saying, no, we're not taking your word for this anymore?
Look, we before we had ESG, when we just had normal capitalism where corporations served their customers and their shareholders and didn't spend as much money on politics back in the 60s and 70s, we got the Clean Air Act, we had Medicare, Clean Water Act. That actually had market improvement on many different metrics in terms of reducing air pollutants, reducing the fact that we used to have rivers that set on fire in the industrial heartland. And now that we have ESG, we have companies that are just flooding the airwaves with advertisements telling the public how woke they are, how socially responsible they are, how they care more about their stakeholders than about profits. Are we getting better results? I mean, I think the proof is in the pudding that we're seeing a shutdown in government policy. The government isn't making any kind of transformative laws that improve the public interest. They're kind of shifting the ball to corporations. And again, on almost any of these metrics, particularly on the environment, where we're seeing increased carbon emissions from some of the leading companies that claim to be the best ESG indicators, I don't think there's much evidence it's working.
Yeah, it's an advertising mask. Lee Fang, reporter for The Intercept. Thank you, as always, for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. We'll be back with more Rising after this.